the modern period, depending on which historian you ask, can start at various different times. But I've been using the word modern in this class so far to mean anything that's post-biblical. So that's a bit of a misnomer. But today, the women that we're going to be studying actually are in what most historians would consider to be the modern period. Rebecca Gratz and Penina Moise. 18th to 19th century is when Rebecca Gratz lived, and Penina Moise, they were late in the century. Rebecca Gratz was born in 1781, and Penina Moise was born in 1797. So let me just share the screen for a moment to show you just where these women fit into the chronology and geography of the other women we have studied before, for those of you who've been to previous Wild Women's classes this semester. So we started out our first session, we studied Benvenida Abravanel and Beatriz de Luna, who was also known as Doña Gracia Mendez Nasi, and they lived in the 15th to 16th century. Beatriz de Luna a little bit later than Benvenida Abravanel. And we spent time talking about these women who lived and who had their impact in Europe, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Belgium. Gluckel of Hamelin was in Germany, and she lived later. She lived in the 17th to 18th century, and we had the opportunity to read parts of her diary, her memoirs. Sarah Bastovin, a little bit later than Gluckel, or Glickel, some pronounce her name, 18th century in the Ukraine. And now we're moving to more familiar territory geographically. We are going to be studying women who had their impact in the United States, most notably Pennsylvania and South Carolina. Rebecca Gratz, as you can see her dates there, and Penina Moise, you can see her dates there. And God willing, at the next Wild Women class, we will study Ray Frank and Regina Jonas, one who lived in California and one in Germany. And you can see by the dates of Regina Jonas that the end of her life, not coincidentally, coincided with the Holocaust. So the first, this is the first text I wanted to show you just to see the overall. I'm going to leave this on the screen for just one more moment in case you want to ground yourself. And I wanted to read to you a selection from a book that I didn't scan. The book is called Rebecca Gratz, Women and Judaism in Antebellum America by Diane Ashton. And I'll write the author's name in the chat. So looking at the dates of Rebecca Gratz, does anyone want to tell me what major events were going on in the United States, both before she was born and after she was born, while she was alive? And the title of Diane Ashton's book may or may not give you a hint on that one. And again, the title of the book is Women and Judaism in Antebellum America. So I'm going to go through now since I can't see everybody all at once. So Ruth, did you want to say something? You need to unmute.
Antebellum would be before the Civil War.
Yes, so you can see that in the later date here, Rebecca Gratz died in 1869. So she lived before the Civil War, and she lived after a different war. So although the title of the book doesn't convey this, as you know from your American history, July 4th, 1776, yes. So Rebecca Gratz lived between two wars, essentially. She was in the post-Revolutionary War period, and she lived during the Civil War period, and also afterwards as well. So I'm going to read to you a selection from Diane Ashton's book. She writes, Rebecca Gratz, the foremost American Jewish woman of the 19th century, lived from the post-revolutionary era through the close of the Civil War. Her life spanned a dynamic and crucial time in the nation's history. Accustomed from youth to Philadelphia's highly charged political atmosphere, Gratz became and remained a fervent patriot throughout her life. The idealism, hope, energy, and commitment to the nation that swirled in the city's local culture captured Gratz's imagination from youth. Because of her family's unique position in Philadelphia's social structure, Gratz experienced a blend of Jewish ethical and American idealist values. These values, fueled by political rhetoric, secular literature, and Jewish religious worship traditions, along with the self-denial and Christianity-inspired piety touted in the women's literature of her time, became Rebecca Gratz's own. So tell me if you've heard of Rebecca Gratz before. Anybody know anything about her, what she was known for? So Beth, why don't you unmute?
Yeah, I don't know anything about her. I've just heard about her.
You've heard about her. Okay, what about you, Lisa? You need to unmute.
I have heard about her, but I can't remember where. I have a book on Jewish women in America, so she must be in that book. That must be where I read it.
No. Risa, you're still muted.
Is Gratz College in Philadelphia named for her?
Yes, Gratz College in Philadelphia was named after her and her family, but particularly her because she had a very strong connection to Jewish education. So
I think I can be heard now.
Now you can be heard.
I believe she started a school for girls to educate them, and not in Jewish things too, not just the normal secular world.
Yeah, so she's actually the one who's credited with the Hebrew Sunday school system that we have to this day. It was modeled after the Protestant Sunday school system, and that is one of her main, let's say her main accomplishments, but what she's most known for. So the other link that I before we go to the rest of this link, actually, yeah, why don't we go to the rest of this link? So the same link that had what I shared before, if you open it on your own screen, if you want it bigger, but it has a nice picture of her, Rebecca Gratz right there. This is taken from the Jewish Women's Archive. You can see she looks very fancy schmancy. She's from a very wealthy family. And a lot of what she contributed to American Jewish life was thanks to her philanthropic efforts and social service volunteer efforts. So someone would read the first selection here from the Jewish Women's Archive. Let me see whose hand is raised, who wants to read something. Alice, did you want to read something, or is this too small for you? You want to open it on your machine? Okay.
I think I'm
unmuted.
Okay. Rebecca Gratz believed that with an unsubdued spirit, she could overcome all life's difficulties. A pioneer Jewish charitable worker and religious educator, Gratz established and led America's first independent Jewish women's charitable society, the first Jewish Sunday school, the Philadelphia Orphan Asylum, and the first Jewish foster home in Philadelphia. She surmounted the grief caused her by the deaths of many family members and loved ones, confronted Christian evangelism. Tell me how to pronounce that word, Rabbi.
Evangelism. Evangelism, second syllable.
God, of course I know that. Anyway, and became a civic leader. Gratz's accomplishment grew out of her own indomitable spirit and her commitments to both Judaism and America.
I keep reading the next part.
Oh, okay. Born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on March 4th, 1781, a middle child among 12 children born to Michael Gratz of Silesia and Miriam Simon of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Gratz grew up in Philadelphia's wealthy society. Her father, her uncle Bernard Gratz, and her grandfather, Joseph Simon, engaged in trading with Indians, land speculation, and coastal shipping. Her brothers Simon, Hyman, Joseph, Jacob, and Benjamin expanded the family's financial interest in the American West.
Okay, we'll stop there.
Okay.
So her family did come from the old country, but they made it big in the United States. Just to give you a little more background on what life was like in America in those days, and particularly in Philadelphia, although there were families like the Gratzes who were able to integrate into society to some extent, there were limits to their full integration, and there also was some anti-Semitism at the time. So I'm going to read to you from Diane Ashton's book, a section that has to do with anti-Semitism. She writes, refinement in Philadelphia did not preclude anti-Semitism. Even sophisticated publications seldom questioned their bigotry regarding Jews, and Rebecca paid a price for her association with the Portfolio crowd. So Portfolio is a subscription, it was a journal, and it was a literary journal. It also was a weekly magazine. It was edited by a Harvard graduate who was an Episcopal lay preacher named Joseph Denny. And it was thought to be a good magazine and literary journal. So it was more for the upper crust. It wasn't like People magazine. And so it didn't have a wide appeal, is what I'm saying. So Diane Ashton continues to write, impressed and intimidated as she was by the literary men in this Portfolio crowd, she faced their contempt for Jews in silence. The first issue of the Portfolio opened with a journal of a tour through Silesia, her father's birthplace, which described Berlin as, and I'm quoting now from this journal, an old town with about 12,000 inhabitants, of which a quarter part are filthy Jews, end quote. So this was in this upper crust literary journal, and it was written by John Quincy Adams, that particular quote, which is a bit shocking. So I wanted to share that with you, and also wanted to share with you a little bit more backgrounds about the time period before we delve a little bit more into Rebecca Gratz's life. So if you could put on the screen, or on your own screen, the link to share with you again. I put them all up before, but I realize not everybody gets the links until they actually sign in. So I'll put it up again. Okay, so you can click on that link in the chat and hopefully see this. This is an excerpt from a book called Written Out of History by Sandra Henry and Emily Teitz. And I have shared selections of this book with you before. On the very first page of this handout, it's page 212, and the title of the chapter in which Rebecca Gratz and Penina Moise are featured, the title is Opening Doors, Women Ahead of Their Time. And you should know that another very famous woman who lived at the time is Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus.
What happened?
Denise.
Wrote the poem that's at the base of the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah, she wrote that poem, right? And Emma Lazarus, actually, there's a quote from Emma Lazarus that begins this chapter in Henry and Teitz's book. And it's Emma Lazarus writes, late born and woman souled, I dare not hope. So that gives you a little sense of the status of women at that time. So not only do we have the status of Jews precarious, but also the status of women. So on page, let's see. Let's start on page 215. Okay, so it's the second page of the handout. So if you have the link and want to scroll to the second page. America had received its first Jewish settlers as early as 1654, and their first congregations developed soon after. In 1729 to 30, the first synagogue structure was built in New York, followed quickly by others in Charleston, South Carolina, Newport, and Philadelphia. By pre-revolutionary days, women's names began to appear in the records. And now I'm going ahead to page 217. So somebody who has it, it's the next page, it's the second column. Actually, we'll start on the first, page 216. It's the paragraph that begins with the words, a scant 2%. Can I have somebody else read that?
Oh, I could do that.
Go ahead, Ruth.
British sympathies the second one. A scant 2% of the population of New York City and even less elsewhere in the colonies, early American Jews had no restrictive structure to hinder their movement in society. Generally accepted in the American Gentile world, with no communal institutions to arrange traditional marriages and a narrow choice of Jewish partners, intermarriage and assimilation inevitably occurred. Many Jewish women were distressed by this trend, and some families sent children abroad to England to be educated and to seek mates. Others had no choice but to accept the fact that offspring either did not marry or left Judaism to disappear into the new post-revolutionary American culture.
Okay, would someone else like to read this, the next paragraph that Ruth read? Who else has it on their screen? Susie?
In the period from 1800 to 1875, some of the most creative and productive Jewish women were unmarried, educated, enlightened, free from family responsibility, and with many doors into secular society open to them for the first time in hundreds of years. These women, nevertheless, chose to work in Jewish education and charity and used Jewish themes in their writings. Choosing Judaism did not preclude an active involvement in the non-Jewish world, and numbers of women moved with ease between the Jewish and non-Jewish society, respected in their chosen fields. This was true not only in America, where Jewish community structures and more were never strong. It was also the case in countries like England, France, and Germany, where barriers of intolerance were breaking down for the first time, taking with them both the good and the bad of the old Jewish communal structure.
Okay, so one thing I wanted to add to what Susie just said is this, even though the two women that we're looking at today are American and lived and practiced and did their good works in America, what was going on in Europe was really significant. After the French, the civil and emancipation in 1791, there was Jews were considered to be citizens of the countries in which they lived in a way that they had never been considered before. It was the Jew, you were a Jewish person who lived in France, you were a Jewish person who lived in Germany. Whereas after the emancipation, there was this idea, well, you can get all the rights you want if you put your French identity, your German identity, your Polish identity, if you put it first, then you can be treated equally. But as long as you keep being isolationist in your religious practices and in the way you deal with legal situations, then don't expect equal rights. So you had a lot of changes going on in Europe that clearly made a difference in the world at large and clearly impacted what was going on in America. So let's go on in that same part where Susie was reading on the second column there, just a little bit of introduction to Rebecca Gratz and Penina Moise, who are both mentioned at the beginning here. Does someone else have the text in front of them that they would like to read? Risa, go ahead. You're still muted. Okay, now you're good.
Yeah, but now I have to get back to the.
Now you have to get back to the screen, right? That's it.
Okay, the women cited on the pages which follow achieved beyond the boundaries of established family and communal life. They chose roles which, while not entirely new, had to be adapted to a totally new environment, a more fluid intellectual and religious climate where men and women were now free to choose not only marriage partners, but religious affiliation. Each of these women took important beginning steps in directions that were innovative for their time. The Hebrew Sunday School, initiated by Rebecca Gratz, was the first for the Jewish communities of America. Modeled on the church Sunday School, it provided the only cultural or religious education given American Jewish children and created a precedent for an evolving American system of Jewish education. Women had composed prayers for other women before Penina Moise began writing, but Moise wrote prayers and hymns for the entire congregation. When feminism and equal rights were just emerging in England, Grace Aguilar influenced women by her scholarly example and educated them in Jewish history and law. Emma Lazarus, a Jewish American poet and scholar, recognized by the broader literary community, was important for dramatically presenting the plight of impoverished Eastern European immigrants to the attention of the unconcerned public.
Thanks for that. Okay, so now let's look a little bit more specifically at Rebecca Gratz. So I'm going to put on the screen, not on the screen, on the link. I have now a link to an excerpt that is from the JPS Guide to Jewish Women, authors Tates, Henry, and Talon. And they have a section of the book that's entitled Jewish Women in the New World. Rebecca Gratz is in this section. And if you click on that link, it's page 249 in the JPS Guide to Jewish Women. By the way, it's a guide to Jewish women who lived between the years 600 and 1900 CE, so it's not comprehensive. It doesn't include biblical women, it doesn't include women who lived in the time of the Talmud, and it does not include women who were born after 1900. Okay, so Rebecca Gratz, let's get a little biography on her. We read that the first paragraph is very similar to what was read from another text. Just the last sentence I'll call your attention to is that he, meaning her father, was a prosperous merchant and one of the founders of Mikveh Israel, the first synagogue in Pennsylvania. And the synagogue still exists. It's a very prominent synagogue. It's in downtown Philadelphia, Center City. So it's not where most of the Philadelphia Jews live in the suburbs, but there is a substantial number who do live in the city, and it's a historic site in the city. All right, so the second paragraph here, if someone would read this, the one that starts with Rebecca Gratz never married. Sandy, you have it in front of you? Okay, great. So you'll unmute and read.
Have to unmute and then
go back to the other screen.
Yeah, one second. And get rid of this. Okay. Rebecca Gratz never married, but moved freely in the well-bred Philadelphia society of teas and dances, mingling with men and women. Many people believe she was the model for the Jewish character, Rebecca, in Sir Walter Scott's popular novel, Ivanhoe. Rebecca had read the book and mentioned in a letter to her sister-in-law, "I'm glad you admire Rebecca, for she's just such a representation of a good girl as I think human nature can reach." Scott had heard of Rebecca Gratz through a mutual acquaintance, Washington Irving, who was part of her circle of friends. Oh, wow.
I don't know if any of you read Ivanhoe or remember Ivanhoe or heard of Ivanhoe, but yes, Rebecca Gratz is considered the model. And in her highfalutin literary circles, she was friends with people like Washington Irving. So it's not surprising that her story was well known and that her story became grist for the mill of fiction. So in the next paragraph after what Sandy read, you can see I'm just going to read out loud some of the organizations that she was involved with and ones she was responsible for founding, including the Female Association for the Relief of Women and Children in Reduced Circumstances, also the Philadelphia Orphan Asylum, which was, as said here, was a facility for orphan children under the auspices of the Presbyterian Church, but it was open to people who were non-Christian as well to be volunteers. And Rebecca Gratz served as the secretary of that organization until her death. Now, if you look at the next paragraph, there's an organization that still exists to this day that it is in the fifth line there, the Female Hebrew Benevolent Society. And she founded this in 1819. And as it says here, it was the first Jewish charitable organization that functioned independently of a synagogue. So it's hard for us to imagine now because there are so many Jewish charitable organizations that exist separate from synagogues. In fact, there are probably more Jewish organizations out there than there are synagogues. But this was really considered to be pivotal and groundbreaking. And as it says here, Such charitable organizations created by upper-class women seeking to do good works filled a critical need for indigents who had no other place to live and found themselves without resources. So that's about these particular organizations. The Hebrew Sunday School is of great interest to Jews around the world, and to us to this day. Every synagogue has Hebrew school. Any person who's gone to Hebrew school, or their children or grandchildren have gone or are going right now to Hebrew school, have, in a sense, Rebecca Gratz to thank for this model. And so the last paragraph on the page, on page 249, if someone would read that, who has that in front of them and would like to read. Lisa, go ahead. You're muted again.
So it'll be faster. Okay, then go back to the page. Sorry about that. Modeled after the format of the Christian Sunday School, this new institution offered Jewish education to children of poor families who could not afford private tutors. Girls and boys studied religion together in these Sunday classes, and Gratz hired women as teachers, a radical change from traditional Jewish education. Rebecca Gratz was the superintendent of the Philadelphia Sunday School for more than 25 years, and it became a model for similar Jewish schools throughout the country, especially those in Baltimore, Charleston, and Savannah.
Okay, so you get a little picture here, just a little bit of a snippet about Rebecca Gratz. One of the great legacies of Rebecca Gratz, in addition to these organizations that she founded and the model that she established for the Hebrew Sunday School, she wrote a lot of letters. She was not a poetess, she did not write novels, but her literary skill was evident in her many correspondences. And in fact, in Diane Ashton's book, she has quite a few excerpts from these letters. One of the excerpts of the letters can be found in the first link that I put online, which was the one from the book called Written Out of History, the chapter that was entitled Opening Doors, Women Ahead of Their Time. We were reading more of the background information about what Jewish life was like and what life was for women, and all of that background to Rebecca Gratz. But in the actual biographical section that's included in this book, on page 221, there is a letter that she wrote to Maria Gist Gratz. Okay, this is okay, it says here who on the bottom left side who she was. So Maria was the wife of Rebecca's brother Benjamin, and Rebecca and Maria corresponded quite regularly. And that quote that I read earlier about Rebecca realizing or commenting upon the Rebecca character in Ivanhoe's book, that's the first section of the letter on page 221. So we already read that first sentence. We can read it again, it's worth reading. So who would like to read this letter? The letter that's dated May 10th. Susie, go ahead.
There is another novel just out by the author of Ivanhoe. If it is as good, you shall see it. I am glad you admire Rebecca, for she is just such a representation of a good girl as I think human nature can reach. Ivanhoe's insensibility to her, you must recollect, may be accounted to his previous attachment. His prejudice was a characteristic of the age he lived in. He fought for Rebecca, though he despised her race. The veil that is drawn over his feelings was necessary to the fable and the beautiful sensibility of hers, so regulated, yet so intense, might show the triumph of faith over human affection. I have dwelt on this character, as we sometimes do on an exquisite painting, until the canvas seems to breathe and we believe it is life.
Keep reading.
Joe and Jack, two of Rebecca's brothers, are managers of the Deaf and Dumb Institution.
And that's very incorrect title that could not be used today.
Yeah, not politically correct. We are all much interested. You will be so too when you witness the expression of countenance every new idea lightens up these poor little blanks. The Colonel will tell you how capable they are of improvement and how happy they appear while receiving instruction. He and our brothers have gone to take a ride this afternoon along the new canal at the Schuylkill. Give my best love to dear Ben and Hyman. Pray Maria give Hyman charges in all his sisters' names, not to expose himself to an unhealthy climate and the approaching warm season. I have many apprehensions of his long journey and wish he was back again. Your husband is very much spoiled as a correspondent. Do you require all his spare time that he cannot give me any? Adieu, my dear Maria. May God bless you and him. Prayers for your most affectionate RG.
Okay, so you can get a little sense of her personality there, not just the things she accomplished. Oftentimes when we're reading a biography, reading selections from a biography, we don't read the primary sources. We rely on secondary sources, and they are it's very much a part of who Rebecca Gratz was, but I think this gives you a little bit fuller picture of her. So we'll end with a secondary source rather than this primary source, just going back to the previous reading that I had up on that I put the link in, the one from the JPS Guide to Women. Let me pull it up on my screen as well. Okay, and we'll read the last two paragraphs there. So I'm on what is in the book, JPS Guide to Jewish Women, it's page 250. And it's the second column, Rebecca, the one beginning with the word Rebecca Gratz. So would someone like to read that? Once you pull it up on the screen. I'll show you what it looks like. So I can. Carol, you have it. Okay. So Carol, you need to unmute. And then you need to go back to the screen.
With me? Okay. Rebecca Gratz made her mark primarily as a social philanthropist. However, through her writings, we can gain some insights into the feelings and experiences of educated American Jewish women of the 1800s, as well as a sense of her own commitment to the Jewish people. A recent scholar of this period views Gratz as having promoted an Americanized Jewish domesticity, totally accepting of her world and her role. Rebecca Gratz, like most of the women of that period, was not a rebel. She used charitable institutions as a vehicle for strengthening her belief in Judaism and Jewish religious education. By thus adapting Judaism to American conditions, Gratz invigorated Jewish life for generations to come. At the time of her death on August 29, 1869, the 88-year-old Rebecca Gratz was considered the foremost Jewish woman in America.
Okay, so that's the little tidbits on Rebecca Gratz. Now let's learn a little bit more about Penina Moise, who lived roughly at the same time, born a little bit later than Rebecca Gratz. And I just put a link in the chat again to show you what we're going to be reading from. Again, I'm going to read you some background information.
Where is it?
Go ahead. I just put it in the chat just now.
Oh.
Yeah, I just put it in right now. Give me a second to find, yeah. I want to show you a picture of her too. See, in the women from the earlier centuries, we didn't have photography to rely upon. So let me see if I have. No, I'm having screen trouble. Okay, I'll try again. Here we go. Okay, I will share screen. It's a very different looking kind of woman. So brace yourself for someone who looks very different than the fancy schmancy picture that we saw of Rebecca Gratz. Okay, so this is Penina Moise, and this is an article that was written about her in the Jewish Women's Archive by J.M. Eidelman. So I'm going to read this first selection here. It's on the screen. And then we'll go to the link that I sent you from the JPS Guide to Jewish Women. Okay, here we go. 3 cheers for California mountain wine, a beverage so pleasant and exhilarating as to make one oblivious to temperance pledges, and which possesses a spell as potent as that of any table wrapper for raising spirits, wrote a poor, nearly blind, and ailing Penina Moise in a letter dated 1875. Despite her suffering, she demonstrated an unflagging poetic wit and love of life. Moise, an early Jewish educator, was one of 19th century America's best-known Jewish poets. Appreciated in her own day for her literary skill and sense of humor, Moise is relatively unknown to present-day readers. So let's learn a little bit more about her from the JPS selection. Would someone like to read that? And that was the most recent link that I put on, the one that says in JPS Guide to Jewish Women. So once someone pops it on a screen and wants to read, let me know.
From what point?
We're on the right side of the page. It's page 255. It's halfway down the page, a little bit less than halfway. Moise, third of the way down, where it says Moise Penina of Charleston, poet, 19th century. Okay, do you see that? No? Okay, let me put the link on again. Okay. Denise, you see it. Okay. I'll put the link in for those of you who can't find it. Okay, go ahead, Denise.
Nina Moise, the fifth of 9 offspring, was born in Charleston, South Carolina on April 12, 1797. Charleston was home to a growing and active Jewish community established in the mid-18th century. The Moise family fled there after a slave insurrection that took place in 1791 in Santo Domingo, the West Indies. Penina's father, Abraham, a Sephardic Jew from Alsace, had settled in the West Indies and married a Jewish woman there. The couple owned a sugar plantation, but once in the United States, they never recouped their financial losses. When Penina was 12 years old, her father died, leaving the family with few resources. Although not the oldest, Penina assumed part of the task of caring for her sick mother and her younger siblings. She left school and helped support her family by doing needlework, but always made time to study and write. By the time she was 30 years old, Penina Moise was a well-known and respected poet. Her work appeared regularly in the Charleston Courier and also in publications such as the Boston Daily Times, the New Orleans Commercial Times, and Goody's Ladies Book. Should I continue?
I'll do one more paragraph.
In 1833, Fancy Sketchbook, a collection of Moise's poetry, was issued, making her the first Jew to publish lyric poetry in the United States. She was a member of Charleston's literary circle and a cultural leader among Christians and Jews, with a salon in her home where writers met regularly.
Okay, so stop right there. And let's someone else continue the readings, beginning with like many other notable women. Does somebody else have it and want to read? Anne, it looks like you're looking.
I'm there.
I'm looking for it, but I had to figure out how to get back and forth to unmute, so I just figured it out.
Got it.
So, okay, so it's the last one now?
Yes, it's the last link and it's page 256. Denise read through the top part of the second column.
Okay, 256. So where shall I start?
Like many other notable women.
Okay, like many other notable women of this period, Nina Moise never married. She devoted her life to poetry and to good works, committing herself to many Jewish causes. When Temple Beth Elohim installed an organ, she began composing hymns for the congregation. In 1843, she became superintendent of the Temple's Sunday school, modeled after Philadelphia school founded by Rebecca Gratz. Moise was the second woman to hold that post in Charleston. When an epidemic of yellow fever raged through South Carolina in 1854, she accepted the traditional role of so many women, Jewish and Gentile, and nursed victims of the disease. Along with other Jews of Charleston, Moise was forced to flee the Union attack in the city during the Civil War. She escaped to Fort Sumter, right? But returned when the war was over and the South defeated. In order to support herself, Penina Moise, together with her widowed sister Rachel and her niece Jacqueline Levy, ran a girls' school.
Okay, would someone else like to finish up this reading? Risa?
Shortly, I'm muted, aren't I?
Yes. You're not an expert in that technology, Risa, as are we all right now, right?
Sure, well, because I can't see both screens at the same time. Shortly before the war, her eyesight, always poor, had begun to fail, and she gradually became blind. Despite this handicap, she continued her writing, using her niece to transcribe the words she dictated. She wrote 190 hymns for the Beth Elohim religious service, which were set to music. The synagogue published a collection of her hymns, and selections from this hymnal were subsequently included in the Union Reform Prayer Book. In more recent times, poetic fashion has relegated Moise's once popular work to obscurity, but in her own day she was loved and admired. She continued to write poetry until she died in 1880 at the age of 83. Referred to as the blind poetess, or as Charlton's gentle poetess, her poetry reflects intelligence, piety, and a resilience to whatever life had to offer. In spite of hardships and difficulties, she always seemed content and cheerful, and remained committed to education and to Judaism. At her death, she was totally blind, and her last words were reported to have been, "Lay no flowers on my grave. They are for those who live in the sun, and I have always lived in the shadow."
Okay, you can see another picture of her here. I misspoke. The picture I shared earlier was not a photograph. It was a drawing, and it's not as flattering of a picture as this one is. Both of them, she definitely has what some scholars have referred to as the stereotypical old maid look, whatever that is. But here she seems, I guess, a little bit more soft than the other picture that was in the J. Eidelman article from Jewish Women's Archive. So I wanted to end this presentation of.
Rabbi, I have a question. Were there a lot of Jews in the West Indies?
Not too many. I mean, there weren't that many people in the West Indies. So
I was surprised that there were any.
Yeah, I was surprised there were any too, but I don't know if any of you have ever been to Curacao. Curacao had an old Jewish community. That was like one place that was, in the Caribbean where some Jews lived. Yeah, there weren't very many. And as you see, they ended up fleeing and were not there for most of her life. She was not living in the West Indies. She was living in Charleston. But no, not a big history of Jews.
Yeah, we were in St. Thomas, and there's a very, very old synagogue there with a sand floor. I think it was supposed to be one of the oldest in the Western Hemisphere.
I mean, Jews definitely existed, but they weren't like the big Jewish communities that we're talking about. And even, quite honestly, even in Philadelphia and Charleston, while these were the biggest Jewish communities at the time, they don't come anywhere close to today. Today, like even if you look at the smallest Jewish communities, just because of the population and percentage of Jews in the population, all the immigration of Jews throughout the last couple of decades, centuries, clearly there's more Jews now than there were then.
Can I just make a comment on her last name? So I've been looking at all of these genealogy things, and the way they designate Jew is Moise, like that spelling actually, even in Polish Judaism and stuff. So that means she was a Jew. That was her last name.
It looks a little bit like Moshe.
It is. That's where it comes from. There, from the Moshe,
So
the Moses.
Like a Bat Moshe. There was
right.
Ben Moshe somewhere in the line, and that family got their name. Thank you for sharing that, Anne. So let's just end with some. I'll share the screen. This actually does appear in one of the links, but rather than you having to scroll through to find it, this is from the first text that I had shared with you, written out of history. So we have this quote over here. I know it's small, but let me I'll put the link in again. So I'm going to read on the right side of the page 227, where it says to persecuted foreigners. And there's some, by means of introduction, you can see the authors right here. Although it would be difficult to determine whether Penina's poem had any influence on Emma Lazarus's later work, it is quite clear that these two women both had the same conception of their country. They enjoyed the freedom it offered and were anxious to share it with all the oppressed of the world. So this, written by Penina. Fly from the soil whose desolating crete, outraging faith makes human victims bleed. Welcome where every muse has reared a shrine, the respect of wild freedom to refine. Rise then, elastic from oppression's tread, come and repose in plenty's flowery bed. Oh, not as strangers shall welcome be, come to the homes and bosoms of the free. And the other selection here from Penina's work is from the Union Hymnal, which was their Reform prayer book, the Union Hebrew prayer book. There were these hymns, they called them hymns, but they're English readings essentially, some of them based on Psalms, but some of them not. This was an original work. And she wrote, it moves on to the next page. So it starts here on page 227. O God, all gracious, in thy gift, though countless blessings lie, my voice for one alone I lift in prayer to thee on high. I ask but for the precious ore contained in virtue's mine, and for the wreath that will endure when diadems decline. Let wisdom of the heart, O Lord, be now and ever mine. Naught else is life's sublime reward. We love thy law divine. I will leave you with that and have a few more comments about these women from you. And then we'll move on to our biblical featured women of the week, of the month, the Daughters of Tzelophechad. Okay, so what do these two women, Penina Moise and, or perhaps pronounced Moise, I've seen a few different on Wikipedia and elsewhere. It seems like the original pronunciation was more closer to Moise. And then later when she's referred to by historians, sometimes, as you know, that happens, pronunciation change over time. So what did these two women, I say most of you had not heard of them or had not known, you had heard of them but not known much about them. What did the two of them have in common, and in what ways were they different, and how can they serve as role models to us? If you want to answer any or all of these questions, Sandy, go ahead.
Well, I think that they actually were able to intersperse themselves into the man's world, because it was mostly men that were doing this. I actually taught when I was teaching Hebrew school, Hebrew high school. No, I think it was religious, the earlier grades. I actually did teach about Rebecca Gratz, because she did. I said, you're here because of Rebecca Gratz. And so they were kind of remembered the name. And so they wanted to know how that came about. So I actually talked about that. But I had never heard of Penina Moise. Very, very interesting in how they infiltrated into the world of men who are mostly leading the way in their type of work.
Interesting. Good comments. Thanks, Sandy. Anybody else have comments to make? Ruth?
I remembered how I knew about Rebecca Gratz. I was in BBG when I was a teenager, and I was in charge of it was a suitcase full of dolls, and I would give a presentation on Jewish women using the dolls. She was one of the dolls.
B'nai B'rith girls, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. And in fact, in the Philadelphia area, the Hebrew high school program, people just refer to it in the shorthand form as Gratz. Do you go to Gratz means do you go to Hebrew high school? Because there is a Gratz college. It's not a university, but it's an independent college. It's in Melrose Park, Pennsylvania, which is very close to Elkins Park, which is where the Frank Lloyd Wright Synagogue is. That's called Beth Shalom. It's in the northern suburbs of Philadelphia. And Gratz still teaches, there are classes there. Many years ago, I took a Yiddish class there. There are degrees you can get in Jewish education.
Music as well.
Music, like cantorial. Saul Wax, who he was the guy who taught all rabbis that I know in previous generations, High Holidays Nusach. So he wasn't a cantor, but he was someone who taught at Gratz, and he taught tefillot, and he made these tapes. Yes, remember cassette tapes? He made cassette tapes that were widely distributed. So almost everyone in my rabbinical school class, even if they didn't actually have the tapes by the time we were in rabbinical school, they had heard of Saul Wax, and he got his training and then trained others to be Jewish educators and cantors at Gratz. So in Philadelphia, the name Gratz is very much part of everyday lingo, not so much outside of Philadelphia, but we all do have Gratz to thank for the Hebrew school system, or from the perspective of the kids, maybe to blame for the Hebrew school system. Yes, Risa.
Yeah, just you mentioned Saul Wax. He was also not only just the liturgical aspect of prayer, but he was known for his ability to teach the meaning of prayer. And I was fortunate enough to take several classes with him, or I had experienced him. He was the principal of the Melton School out in Ohio, where I worked for a year with him.
Oh, very nice, very nice. So he's like a Gratz institution. And I think to this day, he still has a High Holidays cantorial pulpit in the Boston area. It's actually at the shul that my son belongs to in Brookline, KI. And he is, he's the High Holiday Chazan, Saul Wax, and he sings exactly note for note the way it is on those tapes from which I learned High Holiday Nisa. As for Penina Moise, it seems to me a shame that she's not more well known. Certainly, even where we do English readings in synagogue, hers seem very old fashioned to us. So you're not going to find them so much in Reform hymnals, we don't call them hymnals anymore, or in the conservative prayer books, or certainly not in Orthodox or in other denominations. We just don't see her work. I suppose if her poem had made it to the base of the Statue of Liberty, she'd have better name recognition for all of us. All right, so let's shift gears now to biblical women. And I have taught this before, but many years ago, I did find some new texts on them. The biblical texts are the same, but some of the commentaries I have are different. And you could either use a Tanakh that you have, a Chumash that you have, or I just put a link to the text on Benot Tzelophechad, the Daughters of Tzelophechad. Just move my modern women's file out of the way here and make room for Torah. Okay, so
Rabbi, which book of the, I don't remember my parshiot, where am I going to find that?
I'm about to tell you. Okay, so the Daughters of Tzelophechad make an appearance twice in the Torah, twice in the Chumash, but they appear again in the book of Joshua. So where we're going to start is we're going to look at Numbers, the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 27, verse 1. And that's Parshat Pinchas. And here again in Parshat Maseh, with Numbers chapter 36, verse 1. So what I put up, the link that I put up has a different translation than we used before. I think I used it for Tzipora, I used it for most translations. It's the Torah, a women's commentary by Dr. Tamar Cohen-Ashkenazi and Rabbi Andrea L. Weiss, PhD. And it is a publication of the WRJ, the Women of Reformed Judaism and the Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. It's also a joint publication with the University Press. So the Reform Movement's Publication Society used to be called the UAHC. The organization was called UAHC, so the press was UAHC Press. Now it's called URJ. So you don't have to use this translation. This has some, but it does have some very lovely commentaries on the bottom, some of which we'll read out loud. But even if we don't, I wanted you to just have them on the page so that you can look at them at your leisure. Okay. So chapter 27, verse 1 of the book of Numbers. Who would like to read? As we shift from modern text to biblical texts. Myrna.
The Daughters of Tzelophechad. I'm reading out of this book.
What's the book that you have, Myrna? Let me see it again.
Tanakh.
Okay. That's the one that Whitman has. Yes.
Daughters of Tzelophechad of Manassite family, son of Hefer, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, came forward. The names of the daughters were Mala, Noah.
Let me just unpack some of the names of.
Okay.
Before we get to their names, we'll get to their names in a moment. So sometimes in transliteration, you see their names beginning with a Z, and sometimes the they, meaning the daughters of this man named Tzelophechad, sometimes it's TZ. So URJ chooses to use the Z here. It's pronounced in the Hebrew Tzelophechad. So if you look at the Hebrew, it's Tzadi Lamed Fe Chet Dalid, and underneath the Lamed is what's known as a Kamatz Katan. It looks like the T vowel that usually sounds like an ah, but in certain cases, when it's an unaccented closed syllable in Hebrew, it's pronounced as O. So the daughters of Tzelophechad, they were from the tribe of Menashe. So here again in the transliteration, we have Manasseh family, the family of Menashe. Who was Menashe?
One of the sons of Joseph.
Yes, so there was Ephraim and Menashe. Those of you who bless your kids or have blessed your kids or have seen the blessing of kids, been witness to other people blessing their kids, and you say, Yisimcha Elohim ke Ephraim v'ki Menashe. Ephraim and Menashe were the sons of Yosef. They were the grandchildren of Jacob, Yaakov. And while most of the sons of Jacob had a tribe named after them, Yosef was not a tribe unto himself. He ended up with two tribes. So you had Ephraim and Menashe, each considered a tribe. There's actually different ways to list the 12 tribes. If you list it including Levi and Yosef, you have 12. If you take out Levi and Yosef and you put in Ephraim and Menashe, you have 12. Why would you ever take out Levi? Well, it's actually very significant to the story that we're going to read today. Levi was the only tribe that did not have land when they moved into the land of Israel. So for the first part of our biblical story, when we hear about the sons of Jacob, there's no such thing as land. What's land? They lived in the land of Canaan and they didn't own anything. And then they ended up in Egypt when there was the famine. That's how, remember when, well, first Joseph was sold as a slave, and then years later, Jacob and Joseph's brothers, Jacob's sons, they joined him in Egypt. They ended up staying there. And 400 years later, that was how we ended up with Jews as slaves in Egypt. That's how they got there in the first place. And it wasn't until after the time of Jacob, and actually even later after the Exodus from Egypt, when you now could view the term sons of Israel or children of Israel, Bnei Yisrael, as meaning not literally just the biological children of this man, this patriarch whose name was Jacob, but the Israelites. The Israelites are referred to in the book of Shemot already as Bnei Yisrael. And Israel included all of these different tribes. And once they ended up in the land of Canaan, Israel, Judea, changed names many times over. Once the Bnei Israel, the Israelites, conquered the land, each section of the land was designated to a different tribe. So for example, the tribe of Dan had a section in the very north part of Israel, very, very close to the Lebanon border, what's considered today the Lebanon border. Lebanon wasn't there. And also Dan was a little bit near Gaza. So there's sometimes a tribe had two sections. The tribe of Menashe in particular, they had, their land was allocated in two different places as well. Part of it, interestingly enough, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, which today and many generations now has not been considered Israel, the land that we call Jordan, that was the east bank of the Jordan River. There were 2.5 tribes who had allocated land there, including half of the tribe of Menashe. It was Reuven, Gad, and half of the tribe of Menashe. And then the other allocation for Menashe was on the part of Israel that we call Israel today. So just, you need to have a little bit of this background to see where Benot Tzelophechad are coming from. So Tzelophechad was from the tribe of Menashe, and we get a little bit more of his lineage here. Tzelophechad was the son of Hefer. Hefer was the son of Gilad. Gilad was the son of Machir, and Machir was the son of the original man whose name was Menashe, and Menashe, son of Yosef, Yosef, son of Yaakov. Right, so after all of that prelude, now Myrna, you can unmute yourself again and go on and tell us the names of the daughters.
The names of the daughters were Mala, Noah, Hagla, Milcha, and Tirzah.
Okay. All right. So these women, the only two names here that became somewhat popular, one is very popular, one a little bit less so, but you still hear Tirzah, you hear, and you hear Noah. You don't hear the other names so much, maybe they're too hard to pronounce. Any name that has a ch in it is always tough to consider giving to a child outside of Israel. But Noah, it's spelled here in the English N-O-A-H, but the more common spelling transliteration is N-O-A. And in fact, the Hebrew here is Nun Ayin He, which would mean that the H makes sense there at the end. But there are other places where Noah is written where it's just Nun Ayin. In fact, we have someone in the Hebrew school at Temple Beth Am. It's Annabelle Bachman, I believe. Yes, Annabelle Bachman's Hebrew name is Noah, and she spells it without a hey. So she has the shortest name in the Temple Beth Am religious school roster among the student body. Or keep going. Oh wait, one more thing I want to say. The very first word in the Hebrew, so it wasn't directly translated, but I guess it was, but just later on in the sentence. Myrna read that the daughters of Tzelophechad came forward, right? So we take out all that parenthetical stuff about their lineage, and we just say the daughters of Tzelophechad came forward. The Hebrew for they came forward in the feminine plural form is vatikravna. So the first three words of this chapter are vatikravna benot Tzelophechad. Vatikravna, the shoresh, the root of that word is karov, kuf, reish, bet. And it's the same root that we see all throughout the book of Leviticus that we're reading right now in real time in synagogue in the Torah reading cycle. The book of Leviticus is very much about sacrifices, the whole sacrificial system. A sacrifice is known as a korban, plural, korbanot. And the reason they're called korbanot, we tend to translate that as sacrifice or offerings, but really a korban is something that makes you, or you hope that it will make you feel karov yoter, more close to God. It was the way that our ancestors in the days of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and in the days of the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, how they attempted to feel and become closer to God, korbanot. The word karov, also in modern Hebrew, we hear it as relatives are krovim. Lehit karev is to become close. There's a whole movement of outreach that's referred to in the Orthodox world called kiruv. So organizations like Chabad and Aisha Torah and Torah Links, they're referred to oftentimes as kiruv organizations. They are outreach. They try to bring people closer. So they're not trying to convert people who are not Jewish to Judaism, but taking people who already are Jewish and don't feel so connected, or maybe they feel connected socially, but don't feel, or culturally, but don't feel connected religiously and spiritually. They're kiruv organizations to bring people closer. All right, so Myrna, go ahead. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, etc. I'll keep going, and I'll try not.
Okay, they stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of the faction, Korach's faction, which banded against the Lord, but died for his own sin, and he has left no sons. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen." Moses brought their case before the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, "The plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just. You should give them a hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen, transfer their father's share to them. Further, speak to the Israelite people as follows. If a man dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. If he has no daughter, you shall assign his property to his brothers. If he has no brothers, you shall assign his property to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, you shall assign his property to his nearest relative in his own clan, and he shall inherit it. This shall be the law of procedure for the Israelites in accordance with the Lord's command to Moses."
Stop right there. I'm just going to read through verse 11 here in Parshat Pinchas, chapter 27. So what was the claim of Benot Tzelophechad? What was the claim of the daughters of Z from this tribe of Manasseh? What did they want? Elaine?
The land.
Okay, and why did they think they had a claim to the land?
Because there were no sons, so they were the next in line.
So they felt like this is family land, and we're in the tribe of Manasseh, and doesn't seem fair at all that there's this land. Who's going to get this land if there's no sons, right? Shouldn't we get it? We're not sure, how feminist they were not by modern terms. We're not sure if they would have posed the same question. I can only imagine. Would they? Let's say they did have brothers, but they wanted some of the land anyway. I'm not sure if they would have asked. Here, it was very much a situation of there were no brothers, and they were afraid that the land was going to leave the family. So how does Moshe answer them initially? Risa.
He has to go talk to God about it. He doesn't come up with his own answer.
Yeah, verse 5, it says he doesn't answer them. He brings the legal case of Benot Tzlophechad directly to Hashem for a decision. And in verse 5, in fact, the Hebrew here says, Vayakrev Moshe et mishpatan lifnei Hashem. Vayakrev, translated in the WRJ Chumash as Moses brought their case before God, but it's that same root, that karov, kuf, reish, bet, that is the root of korban, the same root that's used at the beginning of this chapter. When the daughters of Tzlophechad approach Moshe, it says, Vatikravna benot Tzlophechad. So there's a lot of approaching, becoming close. First, it's the daughters of Tzlophechad coming close to Moshe, and now it's Moshe trying to become close to God in order to address the concern, the request, perhaps the demand of the daughters of Tzlophechad. Perhaps in other circumstances, Moshe made legal decisions on his own. He certainly did. But in this case, he didn't have enough knowledge to solve the daughter's problem, and he was willing to admit that. So he went straight to the source. And then what is God's answer? God's answer is in verse 7. Before God gives like a bottom line as to where the land's going to go, there's a nice little introduction there. Someone like to read it or paraphrase it? Ruth?
I don't see it. Okay. I have a new computer and I don't know how to use it. I have to keep calling my grandson, but he's in school now.
Okay.
Okay. The plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just. You should give them hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen. Transfer their father's share to them.
Okay, so that's part one of the answer. Actually, it's part 1 and 2. Part 1 of the answer there is kind of an introductory statement in Hebrew. Ken benot Tzlophechad dovrot. Ken is the Hebrew word for yes. And in this context, it means what they are saying is correct. It's right. Yes, you should listen to benot Tzlophechad. You should listen to their claim. They speak rightly. They have a just claim. And so it's a lovely way for God to initiate the answer, that it's not just the answer in and of itself. Oh, give me a second. So it's the introductory statement. And then, I guess the bottom line here for the daughters of Tzlophechad is, yes, they're going to get this land that they requested. But God goes on and gives more of an answer kind of for future generations. So what do you see here? How does God expand upon the answer? Risa.
He gives a whole line of inheritance. If you don't have sons, it can go to the daughters. If you don't have daughters, it'll go to brothers. If you don't have brothers, it goes to, if they're not alive, it goes to their children, but or the father's brother, to uncles. But it gives the whole chain and the order of who should inherit.
Right. So it's not just we're going to answer the immediate problem that's in front of us, but we're going to set a precedent for future generations, because clearly this is not going to be the only time in the situation in the history of the Jewish people that this kind of thing is going to happen. So let's use the Daughters of Tzlophechad case as a precedent. Okay, so To us, it might seem kind of obvious why God approved the request of the Daughters of Tzelophechad, but in the Talmud and the Midrash, the rabbis provide additional insights elaborating on why God was so responsive to the Daughters of Tzelophechad. So I just put a link in the chat to some rabbinic commentaries. And on the very first page, I have just straight English translations of of 6 of these commentaries. From the first couple are from Sifrei. Sifrei is a halachic midrash on the book of Numbers. Then the third source is from the Talmud, from the Babylonian Talmud, from Masechet Bava Batra. The fourth section also from there. This fifth selection is from Yalkut Shimoni on Parshat Pinchas. So it's a collection of midrashim that was compiled in later generations, not in rabbinic times, and Targum Yonatan on the very first verse of what was read today from chapter 27, verse 1 of Parshat Pinchas. Let's read some of these commentaries. So would someone like to take the first one, the Sifrei one? Susie.
When the daughters of Tzelophechad heard that the land was being divided to the tribes, but not to the women, they convened to discuss the matter. They said, God's mercy and compassion is not like the compassion of mankind. Mankind favors men over women. God is not that way. His compassion is on men and women alike.
Whoa.
It's very lovely here. I love this midrash because first of all, you have an inserted dialogue here. So it expands, like many midrashim do this, they expand upon the biblical text, and they specifically address the gender issue, the gender imbalance. They recognize this social injustice and they point it out. They're not just talking about themselves, and this could be part of why God was soft on them, because they did what God wants all Jews to do, which is to stand up for injustice. Now, the second text from Sifrei Numbers, Susie, will you read that one as well?
Mm-hmm. The daughters of Tzelophechad speak rightly. This informs us that their eyes saw what the eye of Moshe did not see.
Okay, that's also a very remarkable text here, right? Because it's commenting on why Benot Tzelophechad, why God thought they were so correct. They saw something that Moshe did not see. What an outrageous comment. I mean, think about this. Moshe Rabbeinu, who's the main character in 4 books of the Torah, main character after God, and he was not able to see something that these daughters were able to point out, that these women were able to point out. There's another text now, this text 3 and 4 from the Talmud. Sandy, would you like to read those?
Number 4.
Mm-hmm.
The daughters of Tzelophechad were learned women. They presented their petition in a logical and halachically sophisticated manner.
Okay, so you just read text 4. Go back and read text 3 as well, because they both go together.
The daughters of Tzelophechad were wise women, for they presented their petition at the right time. So there was a dialogue, right? They had to have a dialogue.
Yeah, and also, I mean, just to see what's going on here, I separated it into 2 texts, although it's really from the same source, from the Talmud. But there's 2 aspects to what they did that are pointed at what made, when God says, Ken benot Tzelophechad dovrot, they speak well, they speak right. What does it mean they speak right? They spoke at the right time, and they spoke in the right way. They used principles of halakha to speak in this sophisticated manner. They didn't just get up there and just start kvetching about what they wanted as individuals. It wasn't just a personal appeal. They used halakha, like, wait a second, this doesn't make sense from a legal perspective. And so that we get that from the Talmud excerpts. Now, if you look at selection 5 from Yalkut Shimoni, we have more of this inserted dialogue. It's not just the daughters of Tzelophechad who are saying stuff, which we saw in the Sifrei, but we also have Moshe responding. So imagine this being inserted into the text that we just read. Would someone like to read the daughters part and someone like to read the Moshe part? Who would like to represent? Carol, would you like to represent the daughters?
Sure.
Okay, who'd like to represent Moshe Rabbeinu? Anne, go ahead. Can I think of
Okay, unmute and
You ready? Give us a portion of land along with our father's brothers.
it is impossible for a daughter to inherit,
Why?
because you are women.
Then let our mothers into Yibum, a Levite marriage, and conceive an inheritor that way.
Impossible, since once there are children, Yibum is not possible.
You are contradicting yourself, Moshe. Either we are not our parents' children and the obligation of Yibum applies to our mother, or we are our parents' children and we can inherit the land. And at that moment, they convinced Moshe. When he heard the justice of their complaint, he immediately presented their case before God.
Okay, so we have to talk about chutzpah, right? Coming, it's a little complicated to understand what they're saying here if you're not familiar with yibum. Yibum, a levirate marriage. We encountered that once, a couple of times in Wild Women class in previous years, but I think it may have been 10 years ago when we studied for the first time the story of Judah and Tamar. So Judah, another one of the sons of Jacob, he was married to someone named Bathsheba, and he had three sons, Onan, and Shelah. And married a woman named Tamar. Married Tamar, and there were no children from that union. And then the levirate marriage responsibility would say that you then have to marry the next brother. So who's you? The woman who was married to a man who had brothers was required by biblical Jewish law to marry the brother or next of kin, if there are no brothers, in order to perpetuate the name, the legacy of the first brother, because he had no children. So the next child is Onan, and Onan sleeps with Tamar, and he decides he's going to he decides to spill his seed, as we say. That's how they say it in the Torah. He decides he doesn't want her to, he's very afraid that something's going to happen to him. The same way first brother got zapped, he was afraid he was going to get zapped. And sure enough, he does end up getting zapped. So and Onan, I say zapped means like they're gone. So the understanding was that she was kind of like a black widow. And so Judah did not want to give his third son in a levirate marriage to Tamar, and essentially just forgets about it. Like he puts her off and says, oh, I want to wait till Shelach's older and then he can marry you, Tamar. But you kind of get the sense that there's no way Yehuda wants Shelach to marry Tamar, because then maybe he'll lose this son as well. So that whole situation there is considered a levirate marriage. And here the Daughters of Tzelophechad are bringing up the concept of levirate marriage, and they're saying you can't have it both ways. You can't say that according to this part of Jewish law, we're considered our parents' children as daughters, whereas according to this other aspect of Jewish law, that we're not considered our parents' daughters. So when it comes to Yibum, we are, but when it comes to land inheritance, we're not. It makes no sense. So they make a legal argument to God, and according to this midrash, it's not just God that they convinced. They convinced Moshe first, and that was when Moshe decides he has a sense that they're supposed to be getting the land, but he kind of wants to check in with God. And then the very last comment on the page from Targum Yonatan, they trusted in the merciful one, the master of the world, and they came before Moshe and the entire congregation at the entrance of the Mishkan. Slight detail that we might have missed at the very beginning of this chapter in Parshat Pinchas is that this whole encounter between the Daughters of Tzelophechad and Moshe happens at Petach Ohel Moed, at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And this was an indication to show the intent, the pure intent of the Daughters of Tzelophechad, that for them, this was a machloket l'shem shamayim. This was a dispute for the sake of heaven, very different than Korach. The Daughters of Tzelophechad mentioned Korach. Korach, that was a rebellion when they challenged, when Korach and his 250 followers approached Moshe and Aharon in a confrontational way. That was not a machloket l'shem shamayim. That was a very self-aggrandizing attempt to make themselves, to lord themselves over Moses and Aaron. But here we get the sense, or at least according to Targum Yonatan's read, is that they trusted in God and their motives were pure. So that's not the beginning and end of the Daughters of Tzelophechad story. In fact, let me just go back. We're gonna look ahead to Numbers 36, but there's one other thing I wanted to point out. Okay, so go back to Numbers 27 to verse 6, and you could use what you have in front of you or the link that I sent earlier. So the verse that introduces the answer, God's answer to Moshe, is Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemor. And it's really very important to point out God's role in all this, because we could have had the same story and it had just been a conversation between the Daughters of Tzelophechad and Moshe, but it goes beyond, because what the Torah is trying to indicate to us here is that God is the repository of knowledge, that God is omniscient. This was essentially Moshe seeking out an oracle. Human beings, including Moshe Rabbeinu, as important as he was, he's fundamentally a listener. Human beings need to be in the role of listener. We also learned something else from just this little introductory phrase here, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemor, and in his admission, Ken benot Tzelophechad dovrot, that the plea of Tzelophechad's daughters is just. We learned that God missed something in creating these laws, that God isn't perfect, and God can admit learning from people. In Midrash Echa Rabbah, the Midrash on the Book of Lamentations, God also admits learning from people. God learns from our matriarch Rachel, regarding forgiveness and enabling the people to return from exile. That's one very famous Midrash. There's also another section in the Talmud where we have God learning from Moshe when Moshe broke the tablets with the 10 Commandments on it, that God, we should have been more angry. You have to read the Talmud there to get a little more expansive on that, but let's focus more on the Daughters of Tzelophechad. So here you have in this chapter, in Numbers 27, the revision of a law, and this revision is initiated by human beings, the Daughters of Tzelophechad. So if this is the image of God that we keep in our minds, how does this selection here, or how should this affect our religious lives? How does this framing of the story go beyond the Daughters of Tzelophechad, beyond land inheritance, and give us a sense of who God is and how we should approach God religiously? Anyone have any comments they want to make about that? Ruth?
I spent my childhood in the balcony, and according to this, I should have been able to sit with my father and downstairs. And if you expand this completely, it would be women's lib in Judaism.
Right. So you're getting, from the gendered perspective, for sure, you're getting women's rights coming here.
Yeah.
And you're getting even, at a more meta level, you're getting something about the role of, in addition to what you just pointed out, Ruth, you're also getting the role of human beings, the idea that God does listen to us, that God can be responsive to us, that revelation, we oftentimes think of revelation in a very distant, kind of transcendent way. It's something that happened on Sinai once and for all. But this kind of revelation that is shown in Parashat Pinchas is that revelation is continuous in a sense, and that God enables us as human beings to have access to God and access to changes in the law. That even though God is the mitzaveh, God is the commander, God provides us with mitzvot, God still does seek to be in relationship with people and encourages us to engage in dialogue. And in this particular case, it's not just men, it's women. Women are encouraged to be in dialogue with God. God isn't perfect, and it's okay. Not only is it okay that God will look the other way, we did something bad, and okay, I'll forgive you for this. It's no, we are encouraged to participate in this ongoing revelation. Risa, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, along with the conversation, it also shows that man can interpret and have an effect on the laws of the Torah, that they're not etched in stone and they can be, as the United Synagogue does, you can interpret and apply the laws to your modern circumstances.
Yes, you definitely get that. And of course, that that whole concept of the evolution of Jewish law, it's implicit and it's believed in all of the denominations. It's true in Orthodoxy, it's true in conservative, right. True in Reform. It's just to a different extent and different mechanisms of change. So in the Reform movement, ideologically, there's more of the belief and the understanding, the acceptance that individuals can make personal choices, that Jewish law can be interpreted by individuals. Within the conservative movement and Orthodoxy as well, it's more about learned people making decisions for the community. In the case of the conservative movement, the CJLS and other individual rabbis and individual communities as the Mara D'Atra. But in the Orthodox movement, it'll be like the great rabbis like Moshe Feinstein or Soloveitchik or any of them who wrote Responsa. There already is an understanding that human beings can interact with God in this kind of way to enable halakha to evolve. So going back to Daughters of Tzelophechad, we need to see the part B of the story, right? Part B is in Parshat Maseh, and that's Numbers, the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 36, verse 1. And I had that in a link as well if you don't have a Tanakh in front of you. It's not the rabbinic text link, it's the one before that. And if you're looking at my page numbers, the page numbers, it's my page number 9. Who would like to read, Elaine?
No, I don't want to read. I want to have a question to just back up a little bit. The first part of what you said in terms of, women are encouraged to speak to God. I don't think that the Orthodox kind of go along with that.
I think it's very, it's hard to, I think Josh Felstein made this point last night when in the Torah study class, that you can't really make blanket generalizations about movements. And I'm trying not to do that. Yes, I'm sure there are some rabbis and some Orthodox people who don't feel that. But remember, I think we might be conflating the idea of women's role in ritual life versus women able to communicate with God. Because even in the most stringent Orthodox communities where women do sit up in a balcony or even worse, maybe behind a mechitza where they can't even see what's going on in the next room, there still is the concept that women can and should communicate with God. And you might remember if you were at the last Wild Women class, when I shared with you some of the techinot of Sarah Bas Tovim. Here was a woman who definitely lived in a very gender segregated society. She definitely was an Orthodox woman who was no way she was on a bima anywhere. There's no way she was, who even know if she went to shul on a regular basis. And when she did, she certainly was behind a mechitza. But she poured her heart out to God in these prayers, and she provided these prayers for other women to say as well. And the idea is that women can communicate with God, it's just in a different venue. So it might be in the more right wing you get within the Orthodox movement, that it might be a different venue, a different forum by which women can communicate with God, maybe not in the halachic realm, but in this realm.
Will God respond to women? That's the other part of it.
Well, I guess, here's another, you keep asking the $1 million questions, Elaine. So you and Betty Ann. What does it mean for God to respond to a prayer? Right? What does it mean? In this case, in the Torah, the story of Benot Tzlophechad, we have a very clear question, or we call it a plea or a demand by the Daughters of Tzelophechad, and then we have a response. We have a response by Moshe and then a response by God. Today, what does it mean that in the days where we don't have prophecy, is God responding to men any more than God is responding to women in that kind of conversational kind of way? Probably not, but yet there are ways we can think of as God responding to our prayers. Sometimes we say, God answered my prayers. It doesn't mean you heard a loud voice from on high uttering words to you verbatim, like the way we have here. So thanks for raising that point, but it's a good point. I think we have to just reframe what we mean by God responding to our prayers. So thanks for that question. And let's move now to the part B of the story here, in the biblical story in Parshat Maseh, chapter 36, verse 1. And who would like to read from either your Tanakh or the one I provided? Ruth. You need to unmute.
I have to learn to use this computer. The family heads in the clan are the descendants of Gilead, son of Machar, son of Manasseh, one of the Josephite clans, came forward and appealed to Moses and the chieftains, family heads of the Israelites. They said, "The Lord commanded my Lord to assign the land to the Israelites as shares by lot. And my Lord was further commanded by the Lord to assign the share of our kinsman Zelophechad to his daughters. Now, if they marry persons from another Israelite tribe, their share will be cut off from the ancestral portion and be added to the portion of the tribe into which they marry. Thus, our allotted portion will be diminished. And even when the Israelites observe the Jubilee, their share will be added to that of the tribe into which they marry, and their share will be cut off from the ancestral portion of our tribe."
Couple of things I need to clarify here. One is the Jubilee, right? Remember there was a June Jubilee celebrating Elaine, right? So Jubilee is a nice fancy word for party, jubilation, but particularly in the Torah, the Jubilee, which is often, the J is often capitalized, it refers to the 50th year. 50th year of what? There's a 7-year cycle of sabbatical years. The 7th year was known as the Shemitah year, still is known in Israel as the Shemitah year. And after 7 cycles of 7 years, after 49 years, there's the 50th year. And one of the things that happened in the 50th year, in the Jubilee year, is shofars were blown, and not in a Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur kind of way, but they were blown kind of as a way of announcing that the Jubilee year has begun, and all land that used to belong to person A now reverts back to person B, or should I say it the other way? Person B, who purchased the land from person A many years ago, in the 50th year, land got returned. So in fact, the pricing, the housing values in biblical Israel were very much dependent on how close to the Jubilee year they were. So if you bought land 5 years before the Jubilee year, clearly it was going to cost less than if you bought property in this first year after a Jubilee year, because when it came to the Jubilee year, when it came to year 50, it had to return. Back in those days also, there were slaves, there were indentured servants and other forms of slaves, and they had to be freed at the Jubilee year. The quote that's on the Liberty Bell, to proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all of its inhabitants thereof, that's a quote from the Torah that's referring to the Jubilee year. So that's a bit of background here in this comment or complaint or plea that the descendants of Gilad, son of Machir, son of Menashe made. So what we had earlier, the claims of the Daughters of Tzelophechad, and now we have this family from a different part of the tribe of Menashe. And what is their concern? What is the nature of their plea, their complaint? Ruth? You can't unmute? She can't see it. Okay, someone, Ruth and her new computer. We will, Carol, go ahead.
Well, I think it's they want to be sure that the tribal lands stay within the tribe and not be redistributed to other ownership, so that it belongs to the tribe. So that's a factor in the decision making.
So how would that happen? So what are they concerned about? Let's say Machla or Noah or Tirzah. They're from the tribe of Menashe. Why wouldn't it stay in the tribe of Menashe? Lisa?
They could marry somebody who wasn't a member of their clan, their particular tribe and marry somebody else who's of Bnei Yisrael, but not Shevet Menashe.
Right. So let's say you have one of these girls from the tribe of Menashe marrying a boy from the tribe of Dan. Then what would happen? Who owns the land? Well, in biblical times, it would have been the husband. And then in the next generation, it would go to the sons. Now the sons are, half of their lineage essentially is Menashe and half would be Dan. But eventually over time, really what's happening is becoming part of Shevet Dan. It's becoming part of the tribal allocation of the tribe of Dan. And so they were concerned about this. And in the same way that Benot Tzlophechad, the daughters of Tzlophechad in the book in Parshat Pinchas said, essentially, Zelo fair. It's not fair what's happening. They also are saying it's not fair. So back in Parshat Pinchas, the daughters said, Lama yigara Shem Avinu mitoch mishpachto. Let our father's name not be lost just because he had no sons. Why should it be diminished? The word yigara, why should it be diminished? And then here we have in Numbers chapter 36, verse 4, in Parshat Maseh, we have these guys from Gilad saying, their share will be cut off, diminished from the ancestral portion of the tribe. So the very same language that Moshe and God of Benot Tzlophechad's claim, now we also have the guys of Gilad, same thing. So how does Moshe respond to the sons of Gilad in Numbers 36 in Parshat Maseh? So let's keep reading. So we're on verse 5. Who would like to read, or someone else can continue reading? You want to read, Ruth? You have that in front of you?
Yes.
Go ahead.
We're up to 5.
Verse 5 in chapter 36 of Numbers. Yep.
Okay. So Moses, at the Lord's bidding, instructed the Israelites, saying, the plea of the Josephite tribe is just. This is what the Lord has commanded concerning the daughters of Tzelophechad. They may marry.
Stop for a moment, just for a moment. Again, we have this language, the same language that God uttered to Moshe in response to the daughters of Tzlophechad's plea. We have here this ken, right? It's ken mateh b'nei Yosef dovrim. Before it was ken benot Tzlophechad dovrot. Justly, rightly, yes, they're speaking well. The daughters of Tzlophechad here, the people from this tribe of the sons of Joseph from Menashe, they are also speaking right. Okay, so now keep going, Ruth.
Okay. This is what the Lord has commanded concerning the daughters of Tzelophechad. They may marry anyone they wish, provided they marry into a clan of their father's tribe. No inheritance of the Israelites may pass over from one tribe to another, but the Israelites must remain bound to each the ancestral portion of his tribe. Every daughter among the Israelite tribes who inherits a share must marry someone from a clan on her father's tribe, in order that every Israelite may keep his ancestral share. Thus, no inheritance shall pass over from one tribe to another, but the Israelite tribes shall remain bound each to its portion.
Okay, so what is going on here? It's okay for Tzlophechad's inheritance to be passed down to his daughters, but there's a caveat. What is the caveat?
They can't pass it to their husband if he's from another tribe.
Exactly. So if they marry a nice gentleman or not so nice gentleman from the tribe of Menashe, they can keep the land, and it can keep going generation to generation as long as the marriage is within that tribal structure. But once there's marriage to others, they have to make a choice between, do I want to marry this guy who's from the tribe of Judah, or do I want to keep this land? So it wasn't a completely egalitarian system here, but it certainly was steps forward from where they were before. And it's very, in a sense here, what's happening is Moshe is promulgating a new law, right? It's a legal decision that he makes here that balances the needs of the individual with the needs of the community. American courts do this all of the time. Yes, a person has freedom of speech, but no one has the right to yell fire or bomb falsely in a crowded theater. not that we have crowded periods today in pandemic days, but there are some limits to freedom of speech, any kind of speech that might endanger the community. And every generation we see in America, we see struggle to understand what are the limits of free speech, but there is this constant back and forth between what do we do for this individual versus the community. And this is something that Moshe is doing here as well in his response to the sons, to the people from Gilad. Can you think of other instances of the law balancing the needs of the individual and the community? Or do you have any other comments you want to make? I see Carol, you have.
Yeah, it sounds to me like it's more restrictive than that. I might be interpreting it wrong, but it says they may marry anyone they wish, comma, provided they marry into the clan of their father's tribe. So it doesn't sound like they can go anywhere to marry anyone. Sounds like anybody in this tribe is okay, but am I interpreting it incorrectly?
No, you're doing it right. I think I was taking it one step further, which is if they did decide to go outside the tribe, they lose the land. And because they so wanted that land, I guess the assumption is, and it was a correct assumption, that they were always going to choose the land, and that they would limit their pool of potential husbands to Menashe. And in fact, in verse 11, we have here, it says that Machla, Tirza, Chogla, Milka, Noah, they did get married to sons of their uncles. They married into clans of descendants of the tribe of Menashe, so that their share did remain in the tribe of their father's clan. So wow. you are correct, Carol. Yes, Sandy.
So in essence, that's sort of a prenup.
Exactly, right. Yes, this is
Rabbi,
yes,
Rabbi, what if the person they want to marry comes from a tribe that has more land or more, assets than the one that they're in? Then
didn't they have had a matchmaker in those days? When did matchmakers start? The matchmaker would not bring that wrong tribe person.
Exactly. And I think also, Elaine, maybe it wasn't just about the amount of land, it's about the sentimental value, the fact that it belonged to their father. I'm thinking now, not the same example, but my Bobby Gina and Zaidi Fred had this, what I thought when I was younger was like the most hideous china cabinet in the planet, but that hideous china cabinet has been in my house for the last 10 years. And I love that hideous china cabinet. It doesn't matter that it's scratched and that it smells moldy inside. And because every time I open up that cabinet, it has the sentimental value. So it's not land, but now I'm dealing with this question. Do I want to keep it? Do I not want to keep it? It'll probably cost more to schlep it from point A to point B, and like, where am I going to put it? But yet there's this sentimental attachment to it. Land, we don't think of land as being sentimental in that kind of way, but it kind of it was like the family farm, right? You want to keep the family farm. And that's undoubtedly part of what was motivating the Daughters of Tzelophechad. I'll take a few more comments, and I have a poem and a story to share. Anybody else want to say something? Either Susie, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking of it more as an overview. God gave all the tribes a set amount of land. If you start swapping, one clan could get more than the other, and then there could be infighting among all of the tribes because I'm one of the women married into another one. So like the Dan married into Judah, and then, so then you're swapping, and then all the brothers or tribes would not be happy because one could, maybe all the Judah men were handsome and gorgeous, and all the women wanted to marry them. And then, they get all the land and everybody else has tiny little portions.
Right. Now, that's a very good point. Right. It's also about shalom bayit within the tribe itself. It's not just about the girls. It's not just about sentimental value. It goes beyond. So yes, thanks for pointing that out, Carol.
I just have a question. The Levites didn't get any land. Where did they live? Was it like Washington, D.C., where they had a little section put together, or where are they?
It's like Washington, D.C., but the Levites, remember, the Levites were the ones who, the Levites, that's AARP calling. Is that great? Okay. Okay, sorry about that.
The
Okay.
Levites basically live behind the store.
Yeah. The Levites, that tribe, they dedicated their lives to serving God. A subset of the Levites, the Kohanim, were the ones who offered the sacrifices, and the Leviim themselves, the tribe from which the Kohanim come, they also were involved with temple duties. And as a result, they were not given land, but there were certain cities around the country in Israel that were designated as Levite cities. So they did have places to live that were these designated cities, but they didn't have land in the sense of being able to have a farm, a family farm. They didn't make their living in agriculture. They didn't get their food from their own land, and they didn't have ShopRite in those days. So the way they got their food was from tithings from Bnei Israel. So the Levites, they certainly were not wealthy, but they did get their food, their day-to-day needs met by the community through the Ma'asrot. So that's a very good point. All right, I'm going to end now because of time. We have two things, and I hope I have time to do both. So let's do the poem, and then I'll share the story with you. All right, so this is a poem that it is included in one of the links that I sent you. It's page 988. It is from the Women of Reform Judaism translation and commentary of the Torah, and it's by Judith Rose, and she writes here, I know about the woman who sits and waits for her life to begin. I know about the young girl who sits with her mother, who sits and waits for her father to come. I know about the young woman who sits and waits for her lover to come. I know about the woman who sits and waits for her husband to come. I know about the woman who sits and waits for someone or something to come. I know about the woman who sits and waits, who passes the waiting onto her daughter. I know about the daughter who sits and frets, who frets about more than time misplaced. I know about the daughter longing for change, who can no longer sit and wait. I know about the daughter longing for change, who gives herself the gift of meaningful spaces. I know about the daughter longing for change, who hopes for her daughter not to sit and wait. So there's that powerful poem, and then there's a story.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, and you do have that in your link, and I'll send that out as well. Let me find this. Okay. I'm going to change, so I have that on the screen, but I'm going to switch to another. Actually, why don't I give you the link as well? Okay, in the chat, I'm going to put in, this is a selection from a book called But God Remembered by Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso. Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, when she was Eisenberg, she was the first female bat mitzvah. She became a Reconstructionist rabbi, and she made her living, and still does, telling stories and writing children's books. This book is somewhere between what I would call a children's book and an adult book. Let me, you can open up as I'm reading.
Rabbi, it wouldn't let us open it. It said request access.
Okay, so I'll put it on the screen then. Give me a second. I had given this book as a gift to my daughter-in-law. It's out of print, and I realized I wanted to teach it today, so I asked her to send me a scan, and I think she probably just gave me permission and didn't do general permission. So I will put it on the screen so that you can see it. Let's try this again. Okay. The Daughters of Z. A lot easier than saying Tzelophechad, right? Okay, so we have that quote from the biblical book, and this is Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso's rendition of this story. After 40 long years of wandering in the desert, the people of Israel prepared to enter the promised land. Everyone was to have a piece of the land. Everyone, that is, except the women. That was the law, and no one questioned the law. No one, that is, except the daughters of Tzelophechad. Their names were Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirzah. People affectionately called them the Daughters of Z. Each evening, Machla and Noah set up their tent. Chogla and Milka took it down again. When the day's journey began, Tirzah made the evening fire. Year after year, they walked through the desert, carrying their tent, dreaming of the land they would one day inhabit. One night, when they were about to enter the promised land, Machla gathered her sisters around a campfire and said, "Moses is dividing the land among the men. Our father is dead. We have no brothers. The law says that only sons shall inherit. We must do something or there will be no land for us." Noah gazed into the fire. "We have been wandering in the wilderness of sand for so many years that my feet are blistered. They feel like sacks of parched grain. Shall we have no place to truly rest?" "If it were our enemies who were keeping us from the land, we would understand," said Chogla. "But it is our own people. For years we have put up with each other. Together we have endured the sharp bristles of the cactus, the sting of the scorpions, and the spitting of the camels. We dwelled side by side in tents. We walked together with God," added Tirzah. "Now we are being excluded. We must act before it is too late, or our hope will die away with this fire, and we will have nothing." Milka proposed a plan. She said, "Tomorrow we will go to the leaders of our people to ask for what is just and right." In the morning, the sisters agreed to plead their case before the judges of the people. They would tell them that unless they inherited the land, their father's name would be lost. This they were sure the men would understand. So the daughters of Z went to the judges of the people. They pleaded, "Give us a share of the land." The youngest judge answered, "This is not for me to decide." The daughters of Z tried to reason. "Should our father's name be forgotten because he had no sons?" The older judge answered, "This is the way things are." The daughters insisted, "Give us a piece of the land. We will care for it. We will plant gardens." The eldest judge refused. "Only sons may inherit. This has always been the law." "The judges will never change," Tirzah sighed. "There is nothing more we can do." Chogla put her arm around her sister and said, "There is one more thing we can try. Tonight we can go to Moses." "To Moses," shouted Noah. "What could 5 ordinary women possibly say to the great Moses, the one who took us out of Egypt?" Milka answered her sister, "We have never been at a loss for words. We are Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirzah. We are women who have wandered in this wilderness. We have waited patiently for the land. We, the daughters of Z, will go to Moses." And so it was that when the new moon rose in the night sky, Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirzah came to Moses. They stood before Moses and the priest Elazar, the heads of the tribes and all the people who had gathered at the entrance to the tent of meeting. It rarely happened that women came to this place of God to speak before Moses. No one moved. A great hush came over the whole assembly. Even the wind was still. Let's reload it. Cliffhanger. Okay. Machla's voice was shaking as she began to speak. "Our father Tzelophechad of the tribe of Manasseh died in the wilderness." Noah's heart was racing. When she heard her sister talk, she gained the courage to speak. "Moses, listen to our plea. Our father was not among those who opposed you. He did you no harm." "He died and left us alone in the desert," added Tirzah. Milka reminded Moses, "He had no sons. We, his daughters, were his only children, and he loved us." Chogla's voice grew strong. "Shall our family's name perish in this wilderness with the bristled cactus, the stinging scorpions, and the spitting camels? Will you not count us among those who enter the land?" Moses looked at the daughters of Z, and he looked at all the people who had gathered to hear his decision. He wiped the perspiration from his forehead, and then he spoke. "Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirzah, you must take your plea to God. I cannot decide." The people gasped. The daughters of Z trembled. They did not move from where they were standing. The sisters held one another's hands, and they spoke to God. "Our God who brought us out of the land of Egypt, Hear our plea. Bring us into the land of promise. Your love, God, is not like ours. We human beings favor some over others, but you, God, do not play favorites. You have enough love for all your creations, for daughters as well as for sons. Grant us, we pray, your love and our share in the land. God spoke to the daughters of Z and said, with eternal love I have loved you. I have heard your plea, and it is just. Then God said to Moses, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, if a man dies without leaving a son, his property shall belong to his daughter. Thus shall be the law according to God's command to Moses. Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milcah, and Tirzah could hardly believe what had just happened. They would have their own place in the land. They would soak their feet in flowing waters, plant beautiful gardens, and eat of milk and honey. God had spoken to them. A fresh wind blew as if it were applauding. The women took timbrels and began to dance and sing praises to God. Many of the people who had gathered at the tent of meeting rejoiced, and the daughters of Z led them in celebration. But not everyone was happy. The men from the tribe of Manasseh, the same tribe as Tzelophechad, were not at all pleased with the new law. They wanted the land to stay within the family. They did not want the daughters of Z to marry outside their tribe. Moses agreed with the men from the tribe of Manasseh, and he believed that this was God's wish too. So Moses issued another law in the name of God. The daughters of Z must marry within their family's tribe so that the land will stay in the family. So it shall be for every daughter who inherits her father's land. The daughters of Z were not pleased with Moses' new law, but this time no one listened to the sisters' objections, and God was sad. Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milcah, and Tirzah married within the tribe of Manasseh. They hoped that in time they could change this law. But after the people had settled in the land of Israel, they forgot about Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. They forgot how the daughters of Z had spoken to God and helped make a new law for all the people. But God remembered the daughters of Z, their courage and their prayer. It is said that their spirit returns to the earth each month when the moon is new, and God's love blesses us all. Okay. How'd you like that story? Nice. I'm going to ask everyone to unmute so we can do a mourner's Kaddish. Ruth is saying Kaddish for her sister, and Phyllis is saying Kaddish for her son. And I'll have them say the names of their loved ones, and anyone else who is saying Kaddish can share names as well. Elaine is saying also her cousin. So Elaine, why don't you start?
I have to leave. You still have 10, right?
Yeah, we have.
Okay.
Let me get the door here. Wait, just one moment.
I'll get a Siddur. Elaine, just tell me, why don't you just say the name of your cousin?
Just a moment. Eric Shans.
Okay, and Phyllis?
Saying Kaddish for my son, Andy Nachem Yisrael ben Pesachesh.
Okay, and do we still have Ruth, or did we lose Ruth?
And my grandmother's yahrzeit.
Oh, okay, Susie. Okay, go ahead. What is your grandmother's name?
Leah Aaron Beiser.
May her memory be for a blessing. Is anybody else saying Kaddish? Okay, let me get the link. The one link I didn't have up here. Sorry about that. It's loading. Getting the spinny wheel. Don't we love the spinny wheel? Mm-hmm. Still loading. I could go to the shul, get a Siddur, and bring it to your house when the time that this takes to load.
Or you could just Google it on your phone.
Oh yes, thank you. So here you can do that. Thank you. Thank you. But I did find it. Better late than never here, I guess. So I have. So either Google or go into the link right there, and we'll go straight
Page 151.
It's in a few different places. If you opened up the link, the Mincha link, it is on different page here. Page 136. So you can look at page 151, which is the evening, morning Kaddish with the same Kaddish. Okay, and I will also put it on the screen. Although then we won't see 10 faces. Okay, I'm not putting it on the screen. Okay. Let's say the Kaddish. Phyllis, will you read us?
Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah, v'yalma divra kivutei v'yamil malkutei, v'chayachon v'yimechon v'chayei dekol Beit Yisrael, v'agalav izman karim v'imru amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah Torah v'olam le'omaya, v'yitgabach v'yitgabah v'yitgapar Nisei, Viet Hadar, Viet Halel, Viet Halal, Shemeda Kudashar, Barakhu, Leila Min Kol, Berkata, Vishirota, Tushbakota, Benechamata, Dami Rambi Alma, Vimru, Amen. Yehi Shlomo Rabbamin Shemaya, V'chaim Aleinu, V'yal Kol Yisrael, Vimru, Amen. Osei Shalom, V'momav, Huya Asei Shalom. Aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you for staying for Kaddish, and thank you for joining us for today's Wild Women. I will compile all the links and put them on the Wild Women site.